Warning! Tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, we're here for the testing phase of the X7, and honestly, the repairs and mods we did to this amp really aren't going to have any impact on the performance that we're going to see out of this amplifier. Most of the stuff we did, or really all the stuff we did, was more reliability related and just putting in some higher quality components that were related to measuring the bias and adjusting it. And so let's throw this thing on the audio analyzer suite and the scope and see what this thing looks like. Okay, so we get the Muzishare amp hooked up to this Tektronix 2235 analog scope and my 10 mA audio generator. And we're going to start off with a 1K sine wave that's set for 2 volts RMS. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.6 volts peak to peak. So let's go ahead and switch this to 2 volts per division. Move this up out of our way a little bit. And pull this up. We have the 10x probe enabled on the output into an 8 ohm loads. Got 100 watt 8 ohm dummy loads connected to the output. Always have dummy loads connected to a tube amp, especially if you're going to inject the signal into them. You can destroy the output transformers if you don't. So let's turn the volume up here and see what we got. We are amplifying, and right there is clipping. And you can see that's right there is the peak of what this amp's going to put out. So let's move up here. And we got 10, 20, 30, 40, approximately 50 volts peak to peak. Doing the math, that's 40 watts RMS before it's clipping. And that is at about 40% of the volume knob, and the VU meter is pegged all the way to the right. So if I turn this down to 0 on the VU meter, that's what we get. 10, 20, 30 volts peak to peak out, which really is nowhere near clipping. So the VU meters are definitely for decoration. If they were set up correctly, the VU meter would be at 0 when the amp starts clipping to let you know that you are getting into distortion. This is in ultralinear mode, so let's switch to triode mode and see what that does. And as expected, it starts clipping much sooner. And in triode mode, we got 10, 20, 30 volts peak to peak, which is probably about 30 watts, maybe a little less. I'd have to sit down and do the math. Can't really do that in my head. And that gives you an idea of what kind of power you'd have in triode mode versus ultralinear. And again, the meter is pegged out. It's a lot more accurate in triode mode. It just goes to +3 when it starts clipping. So if you're in triode mode and the meter's pegged out, you are into full-on clipping distortion. So the next test that I want to do is I want to see how many volts RMS input sensitivity the amp has. So what we want to do, we put it back in ultralinear mode. So what we're going to do here is we're going to turn the input signal way down, just to the point it's still triggering the scope. We're going to turn the amp wide open, switch it to ultralinear mode, and unfortunately, like so many of these China amps, they hit full power at just so little input signal. We've got less than 1 volt peak to peak drives the amp to full volume. So we've got, this is 1 volt per division. That's 1 division. Let's see if we can get a little more accurate reading on this. That's 0.2 volts per division. And we've got 1, 2, 3. So it looks like 0.6 volts peak to peak drive the amp to full power, which is a super hot input, but the R8 was the same way. I'm not sure why. I guess they want to ensure that people can drive these things to full power off their cell phones or something. I'm not sure why they do that. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go back to what we had before. And let me turn this up to 2 volts RMS. And double check this. Is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.6. That's real close to 2 volts RMS. And go back to this. I want to turn this up and overlay the 2 curves, and that's a nice clean signal. And as you can see, they basically lay right on top of each other once you get the volume adjusted to match the input. So really happy with what I'm seeing there. The next thing we want to dive into is looking at square waves. So let's pop this over to a 1K square wave. And so this is set right to the volume setting that was showing clipping with the sine wave, and you're seeing just a little bit of ringing here, which doesn't concern me at all. I would rather see a tiny bit of ringing like this than having, let me see if I can switch this where we get a, here we go, we got just a little tiny bit of overshoot, and really doesn't continue on past the little bit of overshoot. I would rather see this than have it rounded and totally not having this overshoot. I've tuned amps where they're like that and they're just dead sounding. So this looks beautiful. So let's try turning up to 10K and see if we have any issues there. Got a little bit of rounding here, which is to be expected, but there's no ringing. That's a really nice looking square wave, especially for a push-pull amp. Don't see any issues there. Turn the volume up. Just a tiny bit of ringing there at the very front end, but it just almost instantly flattens out. Looks beautiful. Nothing wrong with those square waves at all. So the last one we're going to do is go way down to 100 hertz. And I've pointed out before, my analog signal generator struggles to put out a clean 100 hertz square wave. And you can see it's got a little bit of slope on each side of that. And if you look at the output, it's got just a tiny bit more slope than what's coming in, which is showing me it's got good low frequency response, and I think we're going to see that when we get this on the audio analyzer suite. So I think that kind of concludes what I wanted to do on the scope test. Let's put this thing on the audio analyzer suite and see what the results of that show us. Okay, so we've got the Muzishare hooked up to the audio analyzer suite. And the first thing that I'm going to do, which is what everybody wants to see, is what kind of power does this make and how much distortion is there. So we've got this to pull up to 100 watts. We got it to stop at 5% THD. We're testing it at 1K with an 8 ohm load. And we're doing this first test in ultra linear. This is being run with the KT88-Zs, which in the R8 made about 5 watts less power than the Gold Lion or the China tubes that came with the amp. So I think that's just kind of the nature of the beast. And as you can see down here at low power, we get really low distortion, about 0.1%. 2 watts, we're still at 0.2. 10 watts, we're still at 0.2. So here's where we're getting into the push-pull part of the amplifier. Up to this point, it's likely running all in Class A, and it's down at below 0.2% distortion, 10 watts. We get up to 20 watts, we got 1.1% distortion. And then here at the peak power, which is what I would call this point right here, right before it turns skyward, we're at just under 3% distortion at 38 watts. And like I said, these KT88-C tubes are crippling the amp by about 5 watts at max power. So this is exactly what they claim this amp to be, is a 45 watt amp. So let's do a pull on triode mode and see how much power we're giving up versus distortion. And as you can see in triode mode, it has even lower distortion than it did in ultralinear at the low power levels. Still less than 0.1 up to 2 watts. But it starts climbing a little bit here as we approach 10 watts. And from looking at the curve, it looks like probably around in this 5 watt range is where it starts doing the push-pull thing. And then here at max power, it has less than 1% distortion, but we only have 20 watts. So we basically cut the power of the amp in half. But for most people with even decently efficient speakers, you're not going to be using this 20 watts even. And so definitely is an option to use if you don't need the power and you like the way it sounds. To me, triode mode in these KT88 amps sounds a little flat, but some people like the way they sound. So this was a pull I did earlier in triode mode, and you can see that the frequency response is really flat. It's got a little bit here on the top end, but that's just almost going to be inaudible. And down here at 20 hertz, it's still not even beginning to roll off. So let's do a frequency response pull with it in ultralinear mode and see what the difference is. So here's the test in ultralinear mode, and as you can see, it's a little brighter from 2K up, but it's not extreme. You've got maybe a half a dB up at 20K versus down here at 300, 500 hertz. And I don't really think that's even going to be audible. This is a really nice looking frequency response curve. So I think in either mode, you're going to have a really nice flat sounding frequency response. And at that point, it just becomes the tonality of triode versus ultralinear mode. So here we're going to look at the THD versus frequency. And we did this at 2 watts at 8 ohms output. So when we look at the curve, we have a little bit of distortion here. You know, it's coming up on 2% at 20 hertz. But it quickly goes below 1% at 40 hertz. And then by 200 hertz, it's down to 0.2%. And this stuff on the low end, a little bit of distortion down there, you're not going to hear that in those low frequencies. So this is a nice looking THD versus frequency curve too, especially for a tube amp with, you know, moderate level output transformers. It shows me that these output transformers are at least decent. If they were bad, you'd see this like at 8 or 10% down here at 20 hertz, and we're not seeing that. So these are at least very decent output transformers, and this looks like a really nice performing tube amp. So I'm going to let this thing cool off and then rebias it with the factory tubes and do one more power pull and see what we get with it out of the box. Okay, so we have the Muzishare KT88s back in the amp along with the 12AX7. So here's all the tubes that this amp came with, and one of the things I noticed when I was biasing these tubes up is the bias pots were almost all facing the same direction, or when you were looking at how they were clocked to get 40 milliamps across the cathode resistor. With the tubes this amp came with, the right channel, the bias pots are at 90 degrees from each other. So again, that was the huge mismatch that I was seeing in the tubes this amp came with, which is comical when you read the instruction book that comes with the amp. They explain how important it is to have a matched set of tubes if you're replacing them. So I guess the tubes that come with don't need to be matched, but if you're going to go buy some, you need to make sure they're matched. So I want to show you what these mismatched tubes do to the performance of the amplifier. So this is the right channel, and when we're down here at really low power levels, the distortion looks the same. But if you remember, with the other tubes, we had 0.2% distortion up to about 10 watts. And here it goes. We've got over 1% distortion here at 8 watts. And before, the curve started off down here and then went up as it went into AB mode, and we've lost about 5 watts of power over what we were getting from the matched pair of KT88-Zs, which I know put out a little less power than the Gold Lion KT88s do. So I'm not sure who makes these KT88 tubes the Muzishare amp comes with, but from measuring these and then looking at the performance of these, I would highly recommend replacing those tubes if you own one of these amps. I'm not impressed. So let's do a pull on the other channel just to see the difference, given that those two tubes are a closer match. And you might be asking, why didn't I just click both here? Well, I've learned that when you do both, the results can end up getting kind of wonky. And so as you can see here, when the output tubes are matched, we have the nice profile where at 10 watts it has 0.2% distortion, and then it climbs up just like it did with the matched pair of KT88-Zs with about the same power. At 3% we've got 38 watts. So that just goes to show you how important it is for pairs of tubes to be matched. And like, if you can get a deal on 2 matched pairs of tubes, don't hesitate to buy those versus like a whole matched quad. I mean, it's nice if they all 4 match, but the main thing, as this test shows, is you need both tubes on the same channel to be matched fairly closely. So I think that kind of runs through what we were going to do on this on the testing phase, and got one more video to do after some listening tests and some tube rolling. So let's wrap this up here. Well, as you can see from the testing, this thing to me passed with flying colors. It's got a good frequency response. The power output's right where I expected to see it. I think we could probably eke another 5 watts using some Gold Lion or some of the higher end tubes. I know these KT88-Zs were about 5 watts less, like we're seeing here on the R8. And I don't have any Gold Lions because I sold my Gold Lion KT88s to my friend with his R8. So anyway, I'm pleased with the results. I think they kind of speak for themselves, and you guys saw the scope, square waves, which were super clean, the audio analyzer suite, everything on it looks straight up where you'd want to see it, and I think they did a really nice job putting this amp together. I was impressed by the way the wiring was done in a legit star ground wiring scheme, unlike the R8, which was just a hodgepodge of grounding that made no sense whatsoever. So really all that's left to do is some tube rolling, and I want to do a back-to-back listening test with this compared to the R8, because I think that's the question everybody's going to want to hear is, at the end of the day, which one sounds better, that fully modded R8 or this Muzishare X7? Because honestly, sonically, this is just about how it comes out of the box with some upgraded tubes, which any user could do. So that's probably going to be in another week or two. I'm going to try to get to it next week, but it might be the week after before I get that all done. So just hang tight, guys. And to the owner of this amp, yes, you'll be getting it mailed back to you before the end of the month. And thanks again for sending it to me. I was happy to do these repairs on it, and thank you for letting me feature it on the channel. So if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to the video. Please like the video. Thanks to you Patreon folks, and also you folks that donate, and again to owners like this amp owner that have sent me some gear to feature on the channel. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure y'all do too. So until we can really get down and get this subjective listening test done, I'm not going to pass judgment on this based off just what I'm seeing in the measurements, but I didn't see anything in the measurements to discount this. And I've listened to this amp compared to some of my amps, and I like what I'm hearing out of this. So hopefully a couple of weeks we'll have this whole thing wrapped up. So anyway, until then, have a nice day.